Jesus, a greater authority. G'day, thanks for joining me as we consider God's word from the book of Mark. Now, as we've noticed time and time again in this series, Jesus says and does stuff which leads us to ask a question. Who is this guy? And today is no different. We're coming up to two events in the Gospel of Mark, both of which give us a picture of Jesus' relationship, his authority over the Sabbath. Today we're going to look at one from chapter 2, verse 23. I'm going to read through the whole thing and then we'll think it through. 23. On the Sabbath, Jesus, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And he says to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How we entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to his companions." Then he told them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is the Lord even over the Sabbath." All right, so we've got Jesus and his mates, his disciples. They're walking through a grain field, and Jesus' disciples help themselves to grain. Some Pharisees, they're religious experts in the law and tradition. They see this and they accuse Jesus of allowing his disciples to do the wrong thing. And then Jesus, he answers this with a reference to a guy called David doing something similar. And then he makes this huge claim that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, let's pull it apart. Verse 23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields and his disciples began to make their way picking some heads of grain. Now, just to make this straight, you're allowed to pick grain when you're walking through a paddock according to the tradition and according to the law. Right? There's no Maccas, there's no drive-thrus, there's no, pizza shops or burger places to eat. If you're going through whatever crop is growing, as you walk through the field, you can help yourself to it. Now, you went to grab a bag and load it up. You went to get a sickle and start harvesting. Got to be reasonable here. But as you walk through a paddock, you're going from one village to the next, you walk as the crow flies, go through a paddock, help yourself. Not a problem. The problem was, it's the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, the seventh day of the Hebrew week, and also our week, is Saturday. And on the Sabbath, the Hebrews were commanded to keep that day holy, to keep it special, to do no work. Now, this has a massive history to it. Remember, well, you may not be familiar with this, but God's people, the Hebrews, were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. God promised to save them out of slavery, out of Egypt. And when he did so, think about their identity. You've spent generations living as a slave, 7 days a week, from sunrise to sunset. Your world is consumed with work, mud brick after mud brick after mud brick. And after saving them, God gives them 10 great commandments which shape their entire life and their identity. Their national identity is centered around these 10 commandments which he gives them. He gives them a couple of commands about how they're to relate to him and honor him as the God who saves them. And then there's this kind of command which is connected to who God is, but also to who they are with each other and their identity. They're no longer slaves. They are to take 1 day off each week. Keep the Sabbath holy. What a great rule. This is just genius. First command for you guys in how you relate to each other. Okay, take a day off each week. Cool. But it was a strict duty. You rely on me to provide for you. This is one of the ways that you show that, says God. Taking a day off, resting, is one way of demonstrating your trust in God, that he is in control. So it's also a strict duty. Don't be like the other nations. This is one of the ways you ought to be different. You ought to take a day off a week. And this Sabbath keeping became one of the great markers of their identity. Over time, it became a matter of national pride. We are the people of the Sabbath. We take a day off each week. We trust in God. Now, can you see what the problem is? Maybe. Jesus' disciples, they were picking heads of grain. They were crushing them between their hands to break the husks. And then they were blowing the husk away so they could eat the grain within. Now, does that work? Well, according to the Pharisees, they have a clear opinion. Yes, it is. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? See, these guys had made heaps of extra rules to make sure that the rules were complete. Now, there was actually in the law a rule that you weren't allowed to harvest. And so by inference, you shouldn't be allowed to winnow and thresh you've got to thresh it first, then you winnow it, you've got to break up the husks, and then you separate the husk from the wheat. This is implied from the law that you can't harvest. And these guys, are they doing that? It's a bit nitpicky, isn't it? They're just walking through a paddock to eat. They're just picking stuff out. They're not working, but they created so many rules to make sure that you didn't break the law that, they didn't got to the point where you couldn't even do it by hand, just so you could eat as you're going for a walk somewhere. These rules became quite oppressive. What's the point of the Sabbath? It's a day of joy, of rest, to celebrate who God is and what he's done, to delight and trust in him. And however, Jesus, your disciples, they're harvesting, they're threshing, they're winnowing grain. That's work. They're breaking the law. And implied in this, they're doing so with Jesus' approval. Jesus, what kind of religious man are you? Well, we know they're just going for a walk, just grabbing a bite to eat. No local truck shop to grab a meat pie on the way. They're allowed to grab something to eat on the way. That was already clear in the law. But Jesus, he's blatantly ignoring all the tradition, the precise, over-the-top traditions, where all that spilt ink, trying to nut down carefully what was and wasn't permitted by, learned men like these. What right does Jesus have to walk roughshod over all those years of rule-making to protect this wonderful idea of taking a day off? Well, there's been a precedent. Check it out, verse 25. David did. Jesus says to them, haven't you ever read what David and those others who were with him did? When he was needed and hungry, what did he do? He ate the bread of the presence, which only priests were allowed to eat. And not only did David eat the bread, he gave it to his mates. Now, Jesus, he's not exactly being backwards here. He's being a little bit, have you never read? It's like saying to a concert pianist, can you play Hot Cross Buns? Of course they've read it. The problem is they just didn't understand it. That's the problem, these guys were the recognised scholars of the day. They'd written heaps of laws and rules and extra bits and pieces to make sure you kept God's law, the Sabbath holy. But they missed the point. In their enthusiasm, in their detail, they missed the point. Anyway, the greatest king of Israel was King David. And before he was king, he had to flee from his life from King Saul. And around him gathered a rabble of men. These guys were running away, but unlike David, his followers, a lot of them had dodgy history. And here's David and his dodgy band of likely men. They need food. And David, he kind of quite brashly pressurises the priest to give him bread from the bread of presence to eat. Now, David, he was a great but fallible king. And he was appointed a foretaste of a greater king, someone who had greater authority. Verse 27, Jesus continues, guys, you're also missing the point here. The Sabbath was made for man, for people, not the man for the Sabbath. This rule was designed for the good of people. People were not made for the good of the rules. Oh, you bunch of lawyers, you Pharisees, you're so caught up arguing, nitpicking over the precise details of what's permitted or what's not, and you've forgotten the point. The whole point of what the Sabbath is for, a day of rest, a time to celebrate who God is and what he's done. The Sabbath was given for people, not the other way around. Now, of course, this event, we could stop there and say, wow, isn't that great? Jesus, he reminds us that laws are there. God's law is there for our good. And that's great, because it's true. And he wants the Pharisees to understand that too. But he's making a bigger claim here, because he's allowing his disciples to break the traditions of law, the efforts of all these scholars to try and make sure that we kept the Sabbath day holy. Jesus is talking about his authority here. Because he continues, the Sabbath was made for man and man not for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man, that's his self-reference, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Jesus, he has a higher authority than all the scribes and Pharisees, these experts in the law. Jesus is claiming an authority greater than that of King David. He's claiming an authority even greater than that of the law of Sabbath. Over the past few weeks, we've watched as Jesus has demonstrated authority in what he did and what he taught. He's demonstrated authority over spiritual powers and physical illness. He's even got the authority to declare the forgiveness of sins. And even now, he claims authority over the most sacred of duties, that of keeping the Sabbath. I love the fact that Jesus goes back to what really matters, the idea that to take a day off, it demonstrates the goodness of God's law. It's for our sake, it's for our benefit. But here there's a bigger issue. Again, as we read through this gospel, we're forced to ask ourselves, who is this guy? One who has a greater authority even than King David, a greater authority even than Sabbath itself. Are we giving Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, lordship over our life, our priorities, because he has that right?